my guy.
My friend. My brother in Christ. How's Kumada doing?
Today, my friends, we are going to be going over the top Yu-Gi-Oh decks post the Trix structure deck. What's his name again? Oh, beware of Trix. I guess that makes sense. So structure deck Dark World is just structure deck Dark World, but structure deck Trix is beware of Trix. What you trying to say, Konami? What's going on with ya, big dog? And it is an amazing day for Yu-Gi-Oh! My friend, as I always say, I hope your day is phenomenal, amazing, excellent, grandeur, nothing less. But if it isn't, don't let what happened at the beginning of your day ruin the rest of your day. Today, of course, we are going to have a meta tier list, and structure deck Beware of Trix is said to change the flow a little bit. Let's go ahead and jump on in, as I have 4 different categories. Meta changer. These decks completely change the landscape of the game. Top Yu-Gi-Oh deck. Make no mistake, these decks can compete with meta changer. They just don't change how we play Yu-Gi-Oh. Pretty good. These are some of the most slept on powerful decks in Yu-Gi-Oh, and they're making their own way inside of the format. And lastly, it takes a good pilot. You just gotta be good to pilot these decks. There's no Arby's tier in this particular tier list. It's taken a rest, as every single one of these decks has actually proven itself inside of the format and could be viable at least a regional level. So here we are, big dog, and basically what we're going to be basing this tier list on is how do these particular strategies interact against the meta changer Yu-Gi-Oh decks, as well as some of the most popular cards being played in the format. And just to give you a rundown of some of the more popular cards being played, Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring and Nibiru the Primal Being are probably the top hand traps right now. Then there's Lava Golem, Book of Eclipse, and Winged Dragon Ara Sphere Mode being some of the top techs. I mentioned some of these cards in my Board Breakers tier list, and I plan on making a hand trap tier list very soon to keep you guys up to date on some of the most powerful cards. But let's go ahead and establish what are the most powerful decks in Yu-Gi-Oh right now. Easily, as we all thought, Kashtira is a meta changer Yu-Gi-Oh deck. Now, fortunately enough, Kashtira does not feel like tier limit. My friend, it is a whole different brand of Yu-Gi-Oh. What I love about this format so much, big dog, is that it actually feels a lot more like last year at the beginning of the year, where so many decks compete. And yes, we knew decks like Branded and Sword Soul were some of the top Yu-Gi-Oh strategies, but since they had so many counters that were easy to assess and play in your deck, as well as have advantages against some of the other strategies, it made things so fair. Kashtira has a ton of counters that are available in the Yu-Gi-Oh card game, and while you guys may have seen 9 locked zones at the highest point of competition, I can tell you that's not something that happens extremely often. It's just when, you draw it out, you draw it out. I mean, hey, as long as you think it this way, if your mama drew it out, you probably wouldn't be here, and your daddy wouldn't be in child support debt. Now that you have representation of actually drawing that particular board and not drawing that particular board, I would have to say that Kashtira is one of the better decks, but there are natural counter decks against it. Easily another meta changer deck is Branded, and this deck really does have natural counters against the Kashtira strategy, and is also a very powerful deck on its own. What I personally like about Branded is that it has evolved since last year, just summoning Mirror Jade in Branded and Red Pass. Now it has a ton of utility options, being able to use the Bestial monsters with Bestial Lubellion to be able to power through some really cool plays. But the best thing is that the deck just doesn't automatically lose to Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring on your Branded Fusion, strictly because you have cards like Fusion Deployment to be able to special summon monsters like Red Cartesia for a fusion summon, but also some really spicy other monster targets like Neospace and Aqua Dolphin to pick the Ash Blossom out of your opponent's hand, Fallen Albaz to be able to just fuse with your opponent's monsters, and of course, Dark Magician. My guy, in 2023, there has literally been a deck that got 2nd place at the highest level event using Dark Magician. We're in peak Yu-Gi-Oh. Branded, just like Naturia, actually has a litany of flaws. Anti-Spell Fragrance is a really powerful card against them, so is Dimensional Barrier, and of course, since Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is just so good right now, it's a card that can hit both of these decks fairly well to be able to stop their combos. The last deck that I would say would be a meta changer Yu-Gi-Oh deck is Labyrinth Mommy Milkers. This deck is actually insanely good, and we talked about all three of these decks in my top 5 meta decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! The reason why Labyrinth is just so amazing is because it contrasts these two decks being dependent on getting rid of your opponent's monsters. Well, Labyrinth doesn't really play a lot of monsters for you to get rid of. And what makes things more interesting is since these two strategies came off not needing back row, players actually did not play a lot of back row removal, which made this deck even stronger. One more thing I do want to point out is that an Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is still extremely good against Labyrinth, as being able to hit Welcome Labyrinth or Big Welcome Labyrinth are going to be your key points of interaction, preventing them from getting into the game a lot of times. So again, the 3 best decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Have huge glaring weaknesses, but we also need to make sure that our deck doesn't have the same weaknesses so our opponent can easily just snipe us out of the sky. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump on in, and I may have to eat crow a couple of times because Dark World is actually a really good Yu-Gi-Oh deck. What I was expecting coming into this format is for graveyard reliant decks to still be very present, but as you can see with the big 3 decks not necessarily needing the graveyard, monsters like the Abyss Heals have been fading out, Abyss Dweller has not been useful, and that actually has given Dark World a really niche spot to be able to thrive. What I like about Dark World so much is that Grapha Dragon Roller of Dark World can destroy the Labyrinth cards or force your opponent to use their Labyrinth or branded cards when they really don't want to use them, and that actually can be a huge plus. Against the Naturia strategy, your only biggest weakness is Naturia Riseheart being the last walking macro Cosmos Yu-Gi-Oh deck, but other than that, I think Dark Worlds have a really solid spot of being able to compete inside of this format, and don't know why Konami gave it Structure Deck Dark World instead of like Gates into the Underworld and decided to give Trix a cool name. But Draco Slayers, guys, Draco Slayers actually did top over the course of the weekend, though I still think it takes a really good pilot. Now, this deck will still have all of the same weaknesses, Naturia being able to lock out your zones, the Labyrinth strategy is still pretty good against you, but even more importantly, I think that Draco Slayer as a Pendulum deck takes a big brain Yu-Gi-Oh player to be able to play successfully. Exo Stepsisters! There's only 2 things that are going to happen with Stepsisters: losing and the dryer. No. Fortunately enough, the deck did not lose its dryer, but the biggest problem with Exo Sister right now is that, like, the same thing that goes good for Dark World, it almost goes bad for Dark World. I'm not saying that Exo Stepsisters need your opponent to manipulate the graveyard, but it definitely makes it a way better Yu-Gi-Oh deck when it does. But what also really hurts with Exo Sister is that Ash and Nibiru are really popular cards right now, and that hurts the strategy a lot, alongside of Lava Golem tributing your 2 Exo Sister monsters, which could set you back. I think that this deck will take a great pilot to be able to maneuver through those situations. Exo Sister isn't necessarily a bad Yu-Gi-Oh deck, and it could still trigger your Exo Sisters, which will help you along the way, but decks not reliant on the graveyard and actually being able to mainboard the out as well as the book cards, not necessarily a safe gambit right there for your best way to be able to win or top a high level event. Now, Flunder Race lost Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds, which you thought was huge. But I'm telling you guys, Flunder Race is sneakily still really good. Oh my God. I actually seen a Flunder Race player, shout out to her, and she was clapping up the meta left and right. Branded, clapped up. Naturia, clapped up. Like, oh my God, this deck is crazy. And what this particular player was using was actually Fossil Dynapachi Cephalo. Playing 3 copies of this card allowed you to keep tempo with some of the special summon heavy decks. And if they didn't draw the book card, it was almost like a death sentence against those particular strategies. Regardless, I still think that Flunder Race has a lot of good traits going for it. The Flunder Race Unexplored Winds, allowing you to be able to tribute your opponent's monsters on their turn. Flunder Race Snarl seems extremely underexplored because it can flip your opponent's monsters face down like a Book of Moon. I'm actually holding off hope for this deck, especially seeing that it's one of the few competitive decks that can play Harpy's Featherstorm. So it's a really powerful deck. I think it just needs the right type of Glue Eater to be able to pilot this card into this deck into good contention. Madolche. I have no idea how Madolche topped. I'm still going to put it in takes a good pilot. I don't think Madolche's bad. And somehow every single time we talk about this strategy, it just finds a way to top events, which is crazy. But there's not really anything that Madolche has that does well against Kashtira. If you ask me, this is probably its worst matchup. It can play cards like Lava Golem in Sphere mode, and because of Madolche's Salon, it can actually just normal summon again, which I think is amazing. Now, I'm going to make a bold take, and I think by the end of the format, you guys are going to be like, damn, Cali was right. He normally on it. I think that the Cyber's decks are top Yu-Gi-Oh decks. Both Marine Sets and Math Mech are extremely good. We're in a format where hand traps are actually good. The difference between Math Mech and Marine Sets actually can use World Sea Dragon Zealantis, which since you lock yourself in the water, you can banish your opponent's monsters and you won't be able to summon their monsters back to their side of the field. So essentially you have a walking dark hole out. And Math Mech can play on your opponent's turn with Super Fractoral, being able to make a Trishula-like monster and ruin cards like Kashtira Birth, a monster on their field, and a card on their hand. So they both have their advantages, but the best thing that I want to say is that these are Link-based decks, and you can't Book of Eclipse the Link monsters on the field. So their boss monsters are not going to be easy to out. Makanko! How's Skumada doing? Unfortunately, Makanko completely fell off of the earth. Makanko Warrior, Makanko Libromancer, I still think it's a good deck, but this deck is not great from what I observed going second. And also, Kashtira banishing cards off the deck, banishing cards out of the extra deck makes this deck extremely fragile. I just think right now may not be the time. Now, Naturia as a pure deck, I don't think really cuts the cake as much as the Naturia Runic version of the deck. And the reason why Naturia Runic is so good right now is because I said earlier that players are not playing back row because they didn't expect Labyrinth to be this good. Now, back row removal may come into the format, and Naturia Runic just might be really good instead of a top deck. But for right now, since we still have to respect so many other strategies that don't use back row, I'm going to put it in the top Yu-Gi-Oh deck. Naturia is one of the very few strategies, probably the only strategy in this entire tier list that can protect the Runic cards like no other. You can summon Naturia Barkion to stop cards like Evenly Matched, Naturia Beast to be able to stop Floodgate removal like Cosmic Cyclone. It actually is one of the more toxic decks in Yu-Gi-Oh, which is kind of crazy, being able to have a game state where you can win games just by synchro summoning into powerful monsters, but also if your plan A doesn't work, well, you just deck your opponent out. Now, as you guys know, I did get my invite going undefeated with ninjas, and I have a very, very hot take on Ninja. This strategy is built on being able to flip your opponent's monsters face down, my guy. And if your girlfriend come around here and get Book of Moon, you already know. We might just hit that dark hole. But anyways, ninjas, I would say ninjas are just really good. So ninjas do have their problems. And it has its great side. The great side about ninjas is that Kashtira is probably the easiest matchup in the entire game. Like it's just easy. You can flip their monsters face down and then tribute their monsters before they can get their Kashtira combos off. Like it's really hard to lose against Kashtira with ninjas unless you draw like the worst hand. It is the ultimate solid Kashtira counter. Against Branded, you're not necessarily in a terrible spot, but when you realize you can't flip your opponent's monsters face down and gain the exact same advantage as against Kashtira, then it does even the scale a lot more. Against Labyrinth, there's nothing to tribute. There's not really monsters to interact with. Being able to interact with Lady Labyrinth with a Book of Moon-like card is great. But other than that, you're at a more of a disadvantage with that deck. And if players do start to play more back row removal, then ninjas may actually be on the out because this deck is reliant on its back row. Punk actually is a deck that takes a good pilot. Punk has a lot of the qualities of a top Yu-Gi-Oh deck. It can play a ton of hand traps and it can draw into them. It can also summon some ferocious boards and end the game quickly. It has access to Psychic and Punisher, which a lot of decks just can't handle. The problem with Punk is that Ash, Nibiru, Book of Eclipse, Book of Moon all like destroy this deck. A well-timed Nibiru, well, and anytime Nibiru is GG. A Book of Eclipse to flip the Shirakusai face down, GG. Ash Blossom on the Yugioh, the fusion monster, GG. There's way too many points of interaction in this particular format for pure Punk to be a really good or top deck. But one thing I will tell you is that Punk Therion is still pretty decent. One did get a top, and I think coming into this Trap Trix format, it might actually do some waves. Dragons, guys. Whew. I actually really like dragons in a format where players are light and dark graveyard reliant. When that doesn't pair up, monsters like Bestial Magnamut aren't as powerful, and that's something that you really want to do. You want your Bestial Magnamut to be able to gain the advantage of banishing your opponent's graveyarded cards and getting you a Dragon Search. That puts you ahead inside of card economy. This deck is resilient to cards like Nibiru and Ash Blossom, as dragons have always been, but Book of Eclipse, Sphere Mode, and Lava Golem are new threats to this deck that I don't think it's ever seen. I think you have to be a great dragon player to be able to play into this format, as it is not easy. Scarecrow is either a top Yu-Gi-Oh deck or a really good Yu-Gi-Oh deck. I think it's in the tweener between the two. I'm going to go ahead and put it as the best really good Yu-Gi-Oh deck. I think it has so much room to be a top Yu-Gi-Oh deck, and here's why. Saying that Scarecrow Tryhard is a link monster, the book cards do not work on it. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring and Nibiru, well, Nibiru's powerful against this deck. Ash Blossom, not so much. The deck does play the Adventure Engine to help dodge those particular cards, and Lava Golem in Sphere Mode are good cards against the deck. So I think that it does have a good amount of counters. The best thing about Scarecrow is that Tryhard literally bullies these two decks. If you just summon Tryhard pass, they can't Lava Golem you or Sphere Mode you, and their monsters don't do anything to you. So you can then go for OTK on the next turn. And then if you're going second, you have a high potential to just OTK, flat out OTK your opponent. I'm really torn between putting it as a top or a really good deck, but of course, I want you guys to let me know, what do you think about Scarecrow? I think it's pretty powerful. Now we have Sprite. Sprite losing Sprite Elf literally did not change this deck from being a top deck. This deck is still crazy, and it almost has the exact same feeling of Naturia if you want to play the runic route, giving you the ability to either go for a game the normal conventional way, but if you see an opening, well, you can just deck them out with your rooted cards. I personally like the Live Twin route because the Live Twin route fits more in line with the Cyber's decks. You summon monsters to your side of the field, you build the board, but the Live Twin monsters are link monsters that can't be flipped face down, and they also give you the opportunity to draw into hand traps, which can disrupt your opponent, and you can play a ton of hand traps to follow. Holy, I'm going to go ahead and move this back here because I want to talk about these two together, and you'll see why. Sword Soul is a top Yu-Gi-Oh deck. These two decks are the most proven, and then I would say these two decks still have a little bit to prove, but there's definitely a pathway for these decks to be powerful. What's so crazy about Sword Soul is that Nibiru is in the Yu-Gi-Oh card game and nobody really cares. It's just Sword Soul. Like, it's one of the easiest decks to learn, one of the hardest decks to master, great going second OTK deck that doesn't necessarily care about these because it can play enough hand traps and draw into it, similar to how these decks operate. So basically, almost every single one of these decks in this particular line has a way to draw into their hand traps, play a ton of hand traps, and make 1 to 2 card combos to set themselves up. So I think that's what makes these decks the top decks inside of this format, able to be able to combat the meta changers. I actually expected this deck, tier limit, to be a lot better, like a lot better in Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm going to say it takes a really good pilot. I don't think that this deck is really good, actually. Losing Havness to 1 and Kit Kalo's Band were probably the two most destructive things to happen to tier limit, as now not only can it not play on your opponent's turn, it can't even fusion summon into the big bodies easily. It needs King of the Swamps, and we know that that's a weakness. I don't think that tier limit will be dominant like how it was in the OCG. I think that its run has come as a deck that has max potential of being a really good deck, but probably a deck that's just going to take a good pilot to be able to overcome those free cards that you used to be able to play. Now, here we are, finishing up Trap Tricks and Plants. Plants by themselves, throw them in the dumpster if you ask me. I don't think that this is a legitimate strategy. Ash Blossom, Nibiru, Lava Golem, Sphere Mode, Book of Eclipse, all of them literally wreck this strategy. So I don't think that it's really powerful in that regard. Rika Konkon allows you to be able to tribute your opponent's monsters, which is something that I would 100% watch out for. Going second, being able to tribute your opponent's monsters as a field spell, something that Kashtira zones cannot lock out, and this deck will fear. But I think that there is a lot of potential with the Trap Tricks deck and the Sun Avalon deck combined. If you can make a Trap Tricks Therion Sun Avalon deck, that actually could be a really good to top Yu-Gi-Oh deck. And the reason why I say this is because the Trap Trick monsters are level 4. They allow you to easily go into the Exceed 4. The deck can make Aroma Seraphy Jasmine fairly well. The Sun Avalon strategy could lead off into your Trap Tricks combos, but even more importantly, this Trap Tricks deck does cover a lot of the weaknesses that Sun Avalon has. It can easily go into Gravedigger's Trap Hole to be able to stop your opponent from Nibiruing you or Ash Blossoming you. It can actually get Floodgate Trap Holes, which we already know how good Book of Eclipse is. Floodgate Trap Hole is just a trap searchable version of Book of Eclipse. This deck has so much potential as a pure deck and has so much potential as a hybrid deck. Maybe even if you cut out the Sunvalon, even just a Trap Tricks Therion deck seems extremely good because of Therion Lily Borea. Of course, if you guys have any other tier list that you would want me to do, let me know down below in the comment section. And until then, you can check out these videos as I'll catch you on the next one.